Hey, this is Mike Klassen, and welcome to Vancouver Overcast, a podcast where we have conversations with city leaders and innovators. My guest today is Aldyen Donnelly. She lives in Vancouver and is the co-founder and director of carbon economics for Seattle-based Nori, a company that is building a new platform to enable removing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Nori also hosts their own podcast. Aldyen has been a small business developer and a consultant for over 40 years. One of her passions is sailboating, and it was her time on the water where she became concerned about changes to the marine environment. When she discovered the possible causes were higher concentrations of carbon and nitrogen, reversing climate change became a focus of her work. There are a few people I know who challenge our current thinking about climate policy better than Aldyen, and I'm delighted to have her on the podcast. And now, it's time for Vancouver Overcast. So it's my pleasure to welcome to Vancouver Overcast, Aldyen Donnelly. Aldyen, I've known you for a number of years. Every time I talk to you and we go out to lunch, we have these long conversations. I learn more about you. I learn more about a lot of things, and I'm so pleased to have you here on the podcast. Aldyen, what are the kinds of things that you've done, and where are you today in terms of your key focus of your work?
If you look back over my career, it looks like I've sort of jumped all over the place, and that's true. But there's a pretty common theme. I started as a healthcare economist. I had a wonderful mentor at UBC, Bob Evans, and pretty much everything I've done has been focused on impact of new technology on patterns of practice in healthcare or how companies work, and how to commercialize new technology. So I've skipped from sectors and major topics, but it's always been at that interface between new technology and health and social outcomes.
I've had some incredible conversations with you about energy policy because that's your core focus of your work today. You have views about the carbon tax in the way that as a society we can get to a place where we're reducing greenhouse gases. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But I want to talk about how you made your entry onto the social media stage. Aldyen is at Aldyen Donnelly on Twitter, so I'll put in the show notes how you can find Aldyen on her Twitter account. But you actually bringing on some, I would say, probably pretty nerdy stuff that's on there. I mean, you have to be really interested in listening to some challenging statistics that are really based on what governments are doing today. Tell me a little bit about how you got onto social media.
Well, I didn't get onto social media. You kept telling me to get on Twitter, and I kept not doing it. And then one day you phoned me up and told me that I was on Twitter and told me what my password was.
There you go.
But the interesting thing after that, I thought is, well, now Mike's got me here. What do I do? And I do tend to be a contrarian, but that's not my objective. And I know because I'm disagreeing with a lot of other experts out there, I shouldn't be just a voice saying they're wrong and this is right. So I want to be saying these are the data I'm looking at. Look at them yourself and see what they say to you, because I think the actual facts out there tell a very different story than what's being broadly communicated to the general public right now. So I do tend to post pretty long Twitter streams with attached graphs and data sources and URLs. And the funny thing about all of it is I regularly get a phone call or an email from some very influential person who starts off the conversation saying, that's too much detail. Don't do that on Twitter. Let's take it offline. And this might be someone I've been trying to have a conversation with for 10 years, and the conversation started because of Twitter. So sorry, guys, I'm not going to change my behavior.
I love
it's
it.
Working really well for me.
That's great. You know, I was sort of thinking to myself, there's been a lot of discussion around whether social media is a negative. And truthfully, you know, you see a lot of the media talking about it. And of course, we've seen some very political twists and turns and the whole issue of trolling. I've had very positive experiences by and large. I mean, I tend to be a little bit more careful and well practiced. I've been on Twitter since 2008, so that's pushing almost 12 years. And, you know, I think that it's a medium that if you use well, you can do just exactly what you've experienced, which is start conversations with interesting people that you have never met before or not been able to meet until now, and go out to coffee with them. And before you know it, you're actually doing some pretty interesting work. I also want to note that the fact that this is, you're not your very first podcast, even though I introduced you to Twitter. I certainly didn't introduce you into this medium. You also work with a company called Nori, N-O-R-I. Can you tell us a little bit about Nori?
Nori's a Seattle-based company. There are 10 of us in the company right now. I'm a founder, and we're building a dedicated, what we're calling carbon removal marketplace. So it's a blockchain-based marketplace where we're trying to create an opportunity for projects and that draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and retain it in the natural or built environment to raise financing to get investors. There are all many, many ways to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it, from growing kelp in a certain way to mineralizing mine waste to and our focus right now to start, not our only objective, is to create a marketplace in which food producers, farmers, and fiber producers can earn money for drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere by adopting regenerative ag practices. So there are two realities, or three really. One is conservatively, there are going to be 8 billion, a billion more people in the world in the next 20 years. If global warming is a reality, it's going to be harder to produce food. And the practices that food producers could adopt to make the cropland more resilient in that future and more productive when we have a higher population also happen to be practices that both draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in the topsoil and the root systems, as well as increase moisture retention and reduce leachate wastewater from farming practices. So in my world, if we are worried about all of those things, population growth, the impact of climate change, and reducing the impact of climate change, any rational first investment would be in supporting farmers adopting regenerative practices. So that's my focus right now.
I like to self-identify myself as an optimist. I put that in my profile on Twitter. You have, I think, an optimistic view, even though there are some huge challenges that are facing us today in terms of climate, in terms of shifts in the economy. Is there a reason why we should be optimistic, or is there a reason for us to be afraid? Because right now, I see with movements like the Extinction Rebellion, we're seeing a lot of people that are really fearful about where our planet is going. There's a lot of doomsayers out there. What do you have to say to them? Do you think that we have a way forward that is going to bring us to a healthy and happy planet?
I think we do, and just think over the last 200 years what human beings have accomplished. This is a large challenge. I don't think it's the biggest technical challenge that we've faced in the last 200 years, and I think doomsday scenarios freeze people up from being and slow down innovation. So I think we must be optimistic. But the key to getting through this challenge is to really, really start talking about what good policy and government action is, because a lot of what is being touted as good policy is actually going to slow us down. And we have to learn from our history what good policy, what good government action looks like, and then get excited about it. We're not having the dialogue that we need to have, but we'll get there. We have to get there, and we will get there, but people need to be freed up to...
Earlier last week, I think another edition of the IPCC report came out, and it talked about an urgent need to reduce, I think in the Canadian context, it was reducing by something like 7 or 7.5% the number of greenhouse gas emissions across the country till the end of the century. I remember reading Roger Hickey Jr., who is talked about that in a very interesting column that he writes for Forbes magazine. And he said, we don't even know how to get to 3% yet. So before we start talking about 7 or 8 or 9%, we probably need to think about how to get there. What do you have to say about those kinds of figures? Are they achievable?
He's right. We don't know how to do it. which means any policy in which government tries to set price or pick solutions is really bad policy. If you look back, when we decided finally, late, but finally to get the lead out of gasoline, we did get the lead out in 10 years while the real retail price of gasoline in North America fell by 12%. We got the sulfur out of diesel, or down in diesel, while real prices fell. We got ozone depleting substances and the ozone hole shrinking faster than we had intended to. In every one of those precedents, the actual solutions that were part of that story were solutions that none of us ever actually imagined 5 years before we put the regulations in place. The key to those successful precedents is governments say to people who supply key products and services, reduce the carbon version is reduce the fossil carbon content in the supply chain. I don't care how you do it, you figure it out. And every time we've said, you figure it out, people, industry, have exceeded our expectations and got it done cheaper than anybody thought it could be done. Every time we've tried to set price, where government has said, put the ethanol in, as opposed to take the lead out, we've frozen. We've frozen our markets.
So let's talk about this, because I find this topic fascinating. Right now, we are talking about increasing the amount of tonnage of GHG that we're going to be taxing. And you're talking about telling industry to live by a set of goals and regulations that would force them to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases.
It's interesting, and I don't want to sound overly critical of other people, because what I'm saying today is almost the opposite of recommendations I was making in 2000. It took me a long time to look back and see that any time we were serious about reducing pollutant emissions, we didn't regulate pollution emittance every time we were successful. We'd identified a pollution precursor. So we didn't regulate lead emissions from tailpipes. We said it's the lead in the gasoline. That's the pollution precursor. Whenever we've really been successful, we said to the suppliers, you report your pollution precursor content per unit of sales on a portfolio sales average basis. You reduce it. Any combination of you can comply jointly, so they could trade credits with each other, but government's not involved in that marketplace. It's totally privately operated. And every time we focused on the pollution precursor, again, we've exceeded our expectations. We've reduced the pollution faster than anybody thought we could, at a lower price than anybody thought it would take, with innovations that evolved. You know, the private sector only has two things it can do: compete on price and compete through innovation. So if government sets price, which is one, not my only opposition to carbon tax, or define solutions, like saying put the ethanol in, ordering the ethanol in instead of ordering the fossil carbon content out, we disable the private sector.
So I'm talking to Aldyen Donnelly. She is a consultant who works in the energy sector, and she is talking right now about how we might take a different approach than taxing carbon in order to try and get the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere that are threatening us today. Aldyen, I like how you told me how we did things differently in Europe versus North America on the getting the lead out of fuel. Can you tell us about those two scenarios and how they were different, and why one worked and why one didn't work as well?
Well, in 1978, all of Canada, U.S., Japan, and Europe agreed to phase the lead out of gasoline, petrol in Europe, by 1990. In Canada, we wrote a pretty straightforward regulation that said if you sell gasoline, you report your your lead content. It goes down over time. You can trade credits, and you've got a 1990 deadline. We beat the deadline. When we wrote the regulation, we thought there was only one possible gasoline formulation that didn't include lead that would work. By 1984, we had four competing fuel formulations, which is what led to the price competition. In 1978, when we did that, Europe decided instead to put in a lead differential tax. We got the lead out in 8 to 10 years by 1990. By 1999, the leaded petrol in most of the European nations was selling retail for the equivalent of 40 Canadian cents to $1.40 Canadian per liter premium, more expensive than unleaded, and leaded gasoline was still dominating sales. Europe did not get the lead out until the European nations agreed in 1999 to eliminate the lead differential tax and adopt a performance standard, we call it, regulation that was very similar to the one that Canada had adopted back in 1978. It took me a while to figure out that price differentials don't translate into changes in behavior, as we're often told they do. It took me way longer to start to form an opinion why those pricing signals don't work, and I think I understand that story now. It shocked me as much to learn that as anybody, but yeah, no, putting a price premium at retail sale hasn't worked out in any of the precedents that we can look at.
And because leaded fuel was still being used in Europe during all of those years, it wasn't in North America. In essence, they were poisoning their own people. That's right. For all those many years.
Yeah, we got the lead out in 8 to 10 years. Ultimately, they took 26 years. That's a lot of learning deficiency to build into your kids just because you're hung up on pricing and not getting the lead out.
I want to switch gears to talking about the carbon tax and some of the national policies. I'm with Aldyen Donnelly, and we'll be back in a moment. Aldyen, let's talk about the carbon tax. It seems like this was obviously one of the issues of the federal election, although it did not play out the way the Conservative Party thought it would. What is the policy that the federal government is planning to put forward, and what do you think is not going to work about it?
I'm not sure we're 100% clear what policy the federal government is putting forward, but the advisors to the federal government who are advocating for what they say is a price on carbon have repeatedly published reports outlining in great detail their recommendations from ever since about 2007. And every single report, whether it was published on behalf of Suzuki Foundation by Mark Jackert and Associates, or the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, or more recently for C.D. Howe Institute or the Ecofiscal Commission, if you actually read all 95 pages of each report.
You got to do that sometimes.
Yeah, right? You'll see that the first two paragraphs say taxing or pricing carbon is the most efficient measure. And then they produce forecasts of what will happen. But they also include something called complementary regulations. And in every published detailed report, the complementary regulations account for at least 60% of the emission reductions that are embedded in the analysis. And there's very little detail on how the tax dollars are spent or allocated in most of the more recent reports. So my issue is that nobody's produced a carbon pricing report that actually gets much of the reductions from carbon pricing. And while we're all debating carbon pricing and carbon tax, we're not having a fulsome or informed debate about what efficient and good policy looks like. And I worry that it's inevitable that we're going to have a lot of regulations, most of which will be inefficient if we're not having this meaningful and informed debate about what good regulations look like, because none of the carbon pricing modeling and none of the carbon pricing experience in history has been very effective, and most of it is regulations. So let's move on.
And moving on is going to be really challenging. We've got a public right now, I think, by and large, accept the idea that we need to tax carbon because it's the bad thing, and somehow that will try and take us to a place. We are following our leaders in this journey towards trying to deal with meeting our Paris Agreement goals. And you're saying that this is not going to work, and even the people that are pushing this say that the tax has to be much higher. It puts us into, I think, first of all, politically into a very difficult spot because we have a very large energy industry in here that is facing very serious competition from the United States right now. How do we change hearts and minds on this one, knowing that the public is already there? The public supports doing something about reducing greenhouse gases.
I think we have to find some kindred spirits who are just, accept what I just said. The lion's share of any reductions that are going to occur are going to come out of government moves that are regulatory and not pricing. I'm going to go explain that in a bit. So let's at least talk about what others and our historical experience with regulations looks like so we can start to get that side of the question right. Many of the pro-carbon taxers say, of course, taxing carbon at the point of retail is going to be more efficient than regulation because regulation's always prescriptive. I take great offense when I hear people setting up that bilateral prescriptive regulation versus pricing because our history says regulation is really effective and efficient if it's not prescriptive. And why are we debating as if the only kind of regulation is prescriptive? As I said, getting the lead out isn't prescriptive. It's just saying get the lead out. So there's an artificial sort of comparison out there that we've got to break down, and then we've got to say, there's lots of experience around the world, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, California, that we can look at. I'll put California in context. California has a state law that says when new regulations or tax measures are introduced, the regulators have to produce a scoping report, which shows their estimate of the pollution reductions as they relate to each different measure. Do you know in 2008, when California introduced their cap and trade, their pricing scheme, their scoping report said that California's goal was to reduce statewide emissions by 174 million tons from 2007 levels by 2020. And of the 174 million ton goal, they attributed 1.3 million to their carbon pricing scheme. You can read the report. The rest of it is dozens of regulations.
Right.
And so far, more than 1.3 can be attributed to, of the 174 can be attributed to their pricing scheme, but it's less than 20. So let's look at things like California's experience and say, gee, let's look at those other regulations. Which ones look really inefficient and bad to us, and which ones look pretty good, and which ones can we improve on? And let's have a really active and informed debate and discussion and go for it.
In British Columbia, we've had a carbon tax now for about a decade. What is working about it? What is not working about it? And if you were in the room with the people who are making the decisions on what to do next, what would you tell them what we should be doing?
I would tell them, if my first choice, and then I'll contradict myself, which is my normal practice, my first choice would be abandon the carbon tax, and let's look at the carbon version of the leaded gasoline phase out, which would be a regulation you could write in 12 pages that says if you supply any form of energy in British Columbia, you report your fossil carbon content for the whole energy portfolio, and you got to reduce it by, let's fight over it, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5% per annum, and go from there. I doubt most provincial governments will do that. So let's imagine we just can't get them off carbon tax. And so it's going to be a carbon tax. If it's going to be a carbon tax, right now every government in Canada is focused on taxing at the gas pump and in your utility bill. I call that the point of retail sale. That's very ineffective and very inefficient, so that's just a cash grab. Now, in politicians' defense, they're not hearing this from their technical advisors, so I don't think they get this. I don't think they're consciously going for the cash grab, but that's going to be the result.
Right.
What's the issue there? The issue there is there's this old sort of economic theory, and I'm an economist, and I agree with this theory, that it says if price goes up, demand goes down. But the original theory was right. The economic theory is right. For the price signal to cause a reduction in demand, the price signal has to be on what we call a primary consumption decision, the first consumption decision you make that causes the demand for the energy.
Give me an example of that.
So when you decide where to live and what appliances to have in your house,
right,
and how far you're living from where you work and where your kids go to school and what kind of cars you drive are primary consumption decisions from which your energy demand derives.
Okay.
So if you look at the old real economic theory, not what we're talking about today, it says very clearly that if you want a tax to change consumer decision, it has to be on the purchase of the car, on the car's annual re-registration, on the appliances in your house, those primary consumption decisions from which energy demand derives. So if you're going to be hung up on a tax, which I don't want you to be, that's where you put the tax. And to put that in context, over the last Norway, all European governments tax new car purchases and annual car re-registrations, and the tax is weighted reflecting the car's weight, the car's fuel efficiency rating, and in many but not all cases, the number of kilometers the car was driven since it was last registered, last year. Norway, over the last 5 years, has collected more revenues in the new car sales and annual car re-registration taxes than it has collected in all of its excise and CO2 taxes at the gas pump. And the data really shows that $1,000 of tax revenues collected on the car and the recurring car annual registration is likely to get a change in consumer behavior that would cost $2,500 to $3,000 in payments at the gas pump every week. So if you were serious about designing a tax to change behavior, it goes on the car, doesn't go on the gas pump. But we're not having that discussion. We're not looking at that evidence.
These are, obviously, this is not where we're going right now. So it'll be very interesting to see if that kind of idea gets out there a little bit. I'm not saying that just through Vancouver Overcast podcast, but I would love it if more people were paying attention to these signals that the carbon tax itself is not really driving down the demand in the way that it was designed. You also point out something, and this is what some of the early critics of the tax have, it does have a downward effect on low-income earners. And is that something that policymakers should be worried about?
Oh, yes, definitely. And the thing that frustrates me is if I'm in a meeting with a bunch of people saying price carbon, I say, energy taxes in general are the most regressive tax in our system. And then usually the advocates for pricing tax say, well, we can rebate, we can deal with that. Conversation is 45 seconds long. We don't have everybody sit down and say, okay, how do we design that rebate system to work? It falls apart when you try to design that rebate system to work. Why? The people with the 40% of the richest part of our population only consume 1.8 to 2 times as much carbon-based energy as the 40% of the poorest people of our.
So I want you to repeat that, because I think that's when you told me that in one of our previous conversations, I thought that it was really an important detail. So you're basically saying that if you're a rich person, you're really not that much more of a high carbon consumer than
you're only consuming twice as much carbon-based fuel as the poor people.
Yeah.
But you've got 12 to 18 times the disposable income. For a carbon tax to be high enough to even matter to you, the rich person, it takes the poor person out of their home. if
And
there
this has
was,
happened, right? We've got
Yeah.
energy poverty. We've got an entire department devoted to energy poverty in the UK right now.
yeah,
There are
fuel
other,
poverty, and
Yeah.
their own reports say they're not curing the problem. So let's get over this. We have to come up. We can't guarantee that even the best policy means we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions cheaply. But good policy means it'll cost as little as possible. Then separately, we have to say, how do we work with our low-income families in that context? But the whole idea that it's not arithmetic. There's arithmetic doesn't work. It is not physically possible to have a tax that works because of that huge differential between the amount of energy the rich consume as a percent of their total income versus the same picture for the poor. The other thing is things really get screwed up. The highest and oldest carbon tax in the world is in Sweden. A lot of Canadian experts say it's a really good example. Well, what's the reality in Sweden right now? The reality in Sweden right now is the average household per resident is half the square footage of the average Canadian household, and it is typically 20 to 30% more efficient. And right now, as a direct result of the carbon taxing policy in Sweden, the average Swedish family spends 12% of their disposable income just to heat, space, and water.
It's a big number.
It's a big number. In the OECD, the nations with the fastest growing and highest private debt as a percent of disposable family income are all the nations with the longest standing carbon taxes. That's not a situation we don't need to go there. Let's not go there.
You're listening to Vancouver Overcast podcast, and I have as my guest today Aldyen Donnelly. Aldyen, before we go to another little break, how does industry factor into here? We can talk to the politicians all day long and the policymakers. How do we get industry to move in this direction where they're helping us to find the solutions?
I think on that one, we have to go back to politicians. So we have a well-established, I call it the International Conference and Cocktail Party Circuit, where politicians and industry go meet. It's, typically like 4 times a year in fancy places to talk about solution.
And they fly there.
So let's kick to reality. Worldwide, 50 companies, when I'm accounting for their direct emissions and the emissions consumers have to be able to discharge to consume the products they sell, only 50 companies account for 50% of all of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Wow.
28 of those companies are owned by state governments. 22 are privately held or publicly traded, mostly publicly traded. Why don't we just lock 50 CEOs up in a room until they come out and tell us what the solution is they've agreed to? Why do we need to send tens of thousands of people on planes to exotic resorts to debate over and over? 50 companies. We're talking about 50 companies.
You're making it very clear why I had you on the podcast today. Those are crazy ideas. I mean, who would think that you would take 50 companies and perhaps find a solution that would deal with half the carbon emissions on the planet?
I can tell you what the solution would be. I mean, back when I was a kid, my dad had one credit card. It was called Home Oil. And he used the same credit card to pay the guy who drove the oil tanker up to our house to fill the oil tank to heat it, as he used at the gas station to fill up his car. Exxon and Shell are going to have to go back to that business model. It's not even a new business model. It's their old business model. They're going to go into the electricity and heat supply business. They're going to be integrated energy businesses. And right now, the credit card my dad at 92 still owns to fill up the gas in his car will be the credit card he uses to pay for the electricity and the district heat and the solar power that the integrated energy companies will deliver when they come out of that room, having agreed on the solution. And it's not even a business strategy that's new. It's what they did in the 50s.
So Aldyen, you've done some work with some of BC's First Nations in terms of consulting with them and advising them on how they can take the resources that are on their land. What kind of role do you think some of the First Nations have in really setting the course for our future?
I think especially in BC, because so much of our First Nations territory is unceded in the Chilcotin decision, that First Nations can really turn the tables, and I mean in a way that is not anti-development, but pro-development. And a lot of the leadership that I've been exposed to are hesitant to take the next step for good reasons. So I'm, again, talking about sort of a theoretical future path. But a handful, it doesn't have to be a whole bunch of, I'd say it would only take 13 bands that combine to be subsets of no more than 4 nations could, and I'd love them to do this, identify corridors through their territory and say, guess what? All resource infrastructure, pipelines, transmission lines, even new highway, they go through the corridors. Then we agree on a plan for protecting the environment in those corridors, and we're rehabilitating the rest of the land that's not in those corridors. I've heard recently members of the Canadian Senate start to talk about corridors. I've been talking about corridors with First Nations leadership since about 2012. Then I'd love to see the First Nations leaders say, and in our territory, guess what? Outsiders, visitors who are transiting or using our land, no net new greenhouse gas emissions. I don't care how you do it. You report your fuel use, your energy use, whether it's transporting or operating in our territory. And it's you got 4 or 5 years to get to no net new, and then you start reducing 5% per year after that. I don't care how you do it.
I mean, I don't claim to be an expert on the path of reconciliation that the Canadians are going down with our First Nations, but is this a key piece? I think for reconciliation is obviously people describe what's happening with the Senex development that's going to be happening on the south end of the Bard Bridge as being identifiably a key piece of reconciliation with the Squamish Band. Is there, by the same token, are these kinds of developments that are going to be able to use resources a form of reconciliation in your view?
It depends on how it's done, and I should state that the Squamish is not a band that I've interacted with, but I'm sort of screaming, and I hope I'm not making enemies from my side of the street, but I'm saying that First Nations should exert power and say, hey, white guys, you want access to our territory. It's no net new. Now, if I'm going to build on my territory, if I'm First Nations, I'm not, and increase energy use, then I got to find somebody else who is visiting my land to cut their energy use to get to a net zero increase. But I think they've got the power to do that. I think and the resistance is they're worried that if the ones I deal with are worried that if they actually started to move in that direction, then they might be jeopardizing any and all of their federal funding. And it breaks my heart that that's the fear, and that's a realistic fear. But I think the city of Vancouver should go no net new. If you want to permit to develop or redevelop a building, great. Then go at your expense, renovate as many households and existing buildings as you can to make it no net new. There's an inherent incentive for the new development to be as efficient as possible to reduce the cost of offsetting that amount, and the right people to be mobilizing profitable enterprises to invest in energy efficiency in existing houses are people who know how to build buildings. So don't tell them how to do it. Don't tell them where to do it. Just say, permit condition, no net new.
Well, you really drive home the fact that we have some work to do in terms of local government. I want to talk a little bit about some of the policies that were put in place in the last 10 years or so. You flagged for me some of your concerns around our approach to district energy, which on the face of it sounds great. You're going to connect up all new buildings to a sort of a network of energy supply, and it's all going to be controlled and I guess at some level by the local government, although there are independent companies that are a part of that equation as well. But you've flagged some problems with the way the city is planning how to do that going forward. Can you tell us a little bit about what your concerns are?
Well, first of all, in theory, I'm a fan of local distribution and district energy. My concern is the City of Vancouver seems to be following almost exactly the Danish model, and the Swedish model is similar. In those cases, you hit on it. Most of the district energy systems are owned by city governments. And in most cases, the city governments use their authority to introduce bylaws to compel the neighborhoods to connect to the city-owned systems. And in Denmark and Sweden, who've been doing that, here we call it mandatory connection. There are districts in Vancouver where you are obliged to connect to the city-owned utility or a private utility the city has collected. In Vancouver, anybody who is moving into a new place in one of those sections of town that has a mandatory connection order will be paying significantly more to heat their space and water than if they were using electricity or natural gas. In Denmark, they say obligation to connect. It's not mandatory. They've had the obligation to connect since 1989. None of the municipally owned district heating systems in Denmark can compete directly with electricity now. The average Danish family is spending equivalent to 50 cents Canadian a kilowatt hour.
So how much are we paying by contrast?
11 cents. You know.
Okay.
And only 60% of the households are connected. It's been illegal to install a furnace even in your home in Denmark, and it's still not adding up. In Sweden, the Sweden government actually a few years ago, where it's not 50 cents, it's 45 cents, actually ordered a number of municipalities to privatize their district energy systems because the Swedish courts found corruption in the system. But come on, let's be clear. There's something going desperately wrong everywhere. District heat is city-owned, and city uses its bylaw powers to force the market to become their customers and pay a massive premium over, in our case, electricity, which is a even lower greenhouse gas emission option. I can show you lots of precedents where other cities and countries have allowed cities to do what the City of Vancouver is doing, and I can't show you a story that we as taxpayers and residents would really like to be replicating here. So let's find a different approach to district energy.
Assuming that some of the members of City Council, and this is obviously a new council that's only been in place for a year, we had almost a decade of Vision Vancouver, and they were the ones who brought in some of these big policy changes around energy. What should we tell them? What should they be looking for? Because frankly, it's gone a little bit quiet. I haven't heard that much. They haven't been talking about some of the plans that they have for district energy, at least not, publicly in the council chambers. But there are big things happening in the case of Northeast Falls Creek. We've got South Falls Creek. We've got the energy around the hospital district at Cambie and Broadway. I suppose there's going to be other parts of the city eventually that will be attached to that energy grid. What are the things that we should be doing so we don't go down to a place where we can't return, and we've made it so unaffordable for businesses and residents here that what kind of changes could we possibly make?
I think sort of go back to first principles. Do a really comprehensive map of existing heat supply. I love the idea that waste heat from hospitals would be going into a district energy system, but also map demand and then look at the technical options for reducing demand and see what those two maps tell you. Then step back and say, what are the policies or the guidance we want to put in place to attract private sector investment in the context of that demand supply scenario? We are doing what everybody else did, which is decide, well, to start off, the supplier has to be the city. And to start off, the heat supply has to be operations that the city owns, and we'll supplement them with natural gas, and sometime in some future we'll somehow move to
biofuels
biofuels
wood chips and
wood chips, and I want to go back on that one. So you started with city control, not the map, and then not the whole concept of given the map, what is the private sector opportunity and how do we mobilize competition to exploit this opportunity. So it's not no to district heat, it's how you mobilize investment into district energy.
And you wanted to talk a little bit about the biofuel piece, because I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of this plan, is that the idea that they would be trucking in pellets. And, I've read a little bit about that fuel source, and it sounded to me, well, it didn't sound to me as nice as having piped in natural gas, but what do I know?
Well, there's a First Nations connection here too. So first of all, when you're developing your strategies, make a point of accounting for all of the diesel emissions associated with getting wood waste to a pelleting plant and trucking pellets to downtown Vancouver. Your greenhouse gas impacts look quite different if you properly account for moving that much bio-waste around in trucks and even in trains. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you go into the interior of British Columbia, a lot of First Nations households are heated by waste wood in stoves and furnaces, and a lot of the First Nations culture is built around foraging for the waste wood. If you actually look at the Vancouver's plans to incorporate bio-waste in our municipal heating plan and the suppliers' plans to supply that bio-waste, you're stripping all of that forage out of the First Nations communities who are not attached to the grid or for whom electricity is more expensive. So let's be clear. Don't start bringing wood waste into Vancouver until we've come up with a sustainable energy supply scenario for the First Nations communities we're taking that wood waste away from.
And just imagine what the cost differential will be ultimately for that waste supply that they use for their energy.
And they use that waste supply because most of those households can't afford electricity. They're not big electricity consumers even when they're on the grid because it's already too expensive for them. Yeah, stripping out that wood waste out of the First Nations cultures and communities has got a huge downside.
I'm talking to Aldyen Donnelly here on Vancouver Overcast, and we're going to take a little break, and we'll come right back. So, Aldyen, we've talked a lot about some of the challenges, policy or otherwise, that Canadians face in terms of meeting those Paris targets. What could we be doing here at home that is going to be both achieve some of those numbers and also be potentially politically sellable as well? Because if we can't get the public on side, there's no point in doing anything.
Well, first of all, use our natural gas to make LNG that we use in Canada.
So why aren't we doing that?
I don't know. We are breaking our backs to indirectly and otherwise subsidize the development of LNG plants so that we can somehow get LNG made here and delivered to Asia at prices, Canadian prices at the point of delivery in Asia under $10 a gigajoule. Today, if a mine operator or a train operator went to our gas utilities and said, I want to switch over my equipment from diesel to Canadian LNG, the price quote they'll get on the LNG will be at least 30% higher than the price we're trying to guarantee for LNG landed in Tokyo. Over 30% of the LNG we would export to Asia would be fueling trucks and trains. Why aren't we maybe saying, why don't we build a whole bunch of smaller distributed LNG plants in Canada and switch over our trucks and trains to LNG electric hybrids like now?
And what would that result in? Are we going to lower greenhouse gases
Massively lower greenhouse gases
by moving off of diesel fuels and using LNG?
Yeah, and also shifting gasoline fleets to either diesel electric hybrid and LNG hybrid in the pass through So why are we so focused on shipping that resource subsidized to other nations when the opportunity to fuel switch at home is so enormous? And let's put this in context. Over 80% of the engines that pull trains in Canada were put in service in the late 50s, and they're due for replacement over the next 10 years anyway. We don't even have to accelerate the capital stock replacement turnover schedule. We just have to make this turnover that happens over the next 10 years be to LNG electric hybrid.
Will we have to heavily subsidize truck operators and railway companies for them to be able to make some of these retrofits?
I don't think so. And at a minimum, we should be looking at how much fuel switching we'd get happening if the subsidies we're trying to put in place to make exports work were actually domestically available. I think the numbers would look pretty good. Now, the big globally integrated oil companies really like the idea that they get to maintain their gasoline and diesel sales in Canada while we subsidize their LNG exports. I get why, there's a cake and I can have my cake and eat it too scenario we're giving them, and why they would prefer not to have us switching at home. I just don't understand why we don't value those resources for our own use at home.
So I'm going to try and wrap things up, but I want to ask this one last question. Who's going to be able to take up the challenge of making some of these things happen? It's all well and fine for Aldyen and Mike to sit here in the studio and talk about these really interesting ideas, put them out into public debate, but we've got to find perhaps a new generation of leaders who are willing to run with these ideas, the idea of adapting LNG as a way of reducing our greenhouse gases here at home, looking at regulations that are going to help drive some of the Paris targets, working with our First Nations leaders to see that we can create energy corridors throughout the country. These are really cool ideas. I hope that we can find people that are willing to kind of come on board and have these discussion and debate about them.
You wanted to end on a positive note, and I'm afraid I'm going to go a little negative on you. If we don't expand this conversation between you and I quickly, we will be having this conversation in 3 to 5 years in the middle of a constitutional crisis. Because another conversation for another day, the combination of policies our federal government is preparing to impose on provinces, by definition, not by intent, but happen to massively disrupt the balance of power embedded in our Constitution. So we're going to be in the middle of a constitutional crisis in 3 to 5 years, and most times we find ourselves in a constitutional crisis, we do find our way to the right conversation. I just would really hope that we find our way to the right conversation without having to have the constitutional crisis as the precipitating event.
So for those who are listening to Vancouver Overcast today, the challenge has been put down, the gauntlet has been thrown down. We need to have this conversation about some of the ways that we can achieve these targets. We have to maybe start asking some tougher questions about the policies that we're putting in place now and challenging our leaders and our bureaucracy to really have these conversations amongst themselves and involve other leaders and people like yourself to put the evidence on the table as to how we're going to get there. Aldyen, I want to thank you very much. We have all these great conversations. It's really great to get one down as a recording. I look forward for us to be able to do this in the future. Thanks very much for coming on the show.
And thank you very much for having me, Mike.
Thanks very much for listening to Vancouver Overcast, and I hope you subscribe and tell your friends about this program. We're going to have more great conversations with city leaders and innovators in the weeks to come.